"Get out of the way, you old geezer!" An angry biker threw a brutal punch, knocking down a war veteran at a gas station. The scene, captured by indifferent cell phones, seemed to seal the old soldier's humiliation. But when black SUVs stormed onto the scene, and the police chief, the veteran's own son, stepped out with fire blazing in his eyes, everything changed. What was meant to be just another act of cowardice turned into a clash of honor and redemption the town would never forget. And you? What do you think about the bikers' actions? Get ready for a story where every choice echoes far beyond a single punch. The sky over Ashford Hollow wore a heavy gray shroud that morning, pressing down on the sleepy town like a judgment waiting to fall. The bitter wind rattled the loose sign of Riley's Gas and Service, a lonely outpost at the edge of the highway, forgotten by time and spared by neither progress nor decay. At 7:28 a.m., a faded 1998 Buick rolled up to pump number 2. The driver, a man of 70 winters, moved with slow, deliberate strength as he exited the car. His name was Walter "Walt" Granger, a man whose weathered face bore the silent stories of battles fought far beyond the borders of this quiet town. Dressed in his best flannel shirt, a polished veteran's pin gleaming against his chest, Walt was a symbol of a world that once believed in things like duty, honor, and sacrifice. He adjusted the brim of his cap and noticed them almost immediately. 5 young men clustered at the entrance to the tiny convenience store. They leaned against their roaring motorcycles, thick jackets draped over cocky shoulders, guzzling energy drinks and laughing too loud for the morning stillness. Their laughter wasn't joyful, it was sharp, mocking, the sound of boys pretending to be men. They blocked the narrow entrance entirely, forcing the few customers who dared approach to turn away. Walt's steps did not falter. Age had slowed him, but it had not softened the steel in his spine. He walked toward the store with quiet purpose, each step punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of his boots on the cracked pavement. The cold gnawed at his joints, but he ignored it. Stopping a few feet from the group, Walt lifted his chin and spoke, his voice clear, measured, and steady. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said, his tone polite but commanding. "Would you mind clearing the way? Others need to get inside." The laughter ceased in an instant, as if the wind itself had held its breath. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, with tattoos creeping up his neck, turned to face him. Brady Knox, the kind of youth who mistook loudness for strength and disrespect for rebellion. Brady smirked, looking Walt up and down like a predator sizing up a wounded animal. "Look at that," he sneered. "Grandpa thinks he can still give orders." The others snickered, emboldened by their leader's mockery. Walt's expression didn't change. He stood his ground. "It's not about orders, son. It's about respect." Those words, so simple yet so foreign to them, sparked something ugly. Before anyone could react, Brady stepped forward and, in a blur of motion, drove his fist into Walt's face. The impact sent Walt sprawling backward. He hit the concrete with a sickening thud, his veteran's pin skittering across the ground like a fallen medal. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Even the motorcycle's engines sounded distant, muted. Walt lay there, blood trickling from his temple, one hand trembling as he struggled to sit up. The pain was sharp, but he gritted his teeth against it. He had endured worse in lands far from home. The crowd, sparse but growing, did nothing. Phones were lifted, cameras flashed. Not a single hand reached out to help. It was a portrait of modern cowardice, choosing to record rather than respond. With slow, aching movements, Walt pulled a white handkerchief from his pocket, a relic of his late wife, embroidered with her initials, and pressed it against his bleeding forehead. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. He simply breathed, slow, steady, like he had done in foxholes and trenches long ago. Brady and his crew shifted uneasily, the adrenaline of the assault already curdling into regret. But Walt didn't look at them. He looked at the horizon, at the gray sky hanging over Ashford Hollow, and knew. His fight wasn't against fists or foolishness. It was against a world that had forgotten the cost of the freedoms they took for granted, and he, even battered and bleeding, would not surrender. Not today. The cold gnawed harder at the edges of Ashford Hollow, as Walt Granger struggled to steady himself, one hand pressed against the rough concrete for balance. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining the pristine white of his handkerchief, yet his eyes remained fierce, the fire within them unextinguished. Across the lot the young men shifted, their bravado crumbling into an uneasy silence. None dared meet Walt's gaze. The wind carried the distant sounds of Sunday life, a church bell tolling, a dog barking, a child's laughter, cruel reminders that the world moved on, indifferent to acts of cowardice. And then, cutting through, the stillness, the screech of tires against asphalt. A blue sedan slid into the vacant pump nearby. Its driver, a tall young man with sharp features and a determined stride, slammed the door and sprinted toward the fallen veteran. Evan Turner, Walt would later learn his name to be. Without hesitation, Evan knelt at Walt's side. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, voice low but urgent. Walt gave a tired, blood-smeared smile. "I've seen worse, son," he muttered. "Takes more than a punch to bring me down." But Evan could see the damage. The split skin, the dazed look in Walt's weathered eyes, the deep bruise forming along his jawline. This was no minor scuffle. Carefully, Evan retrieved a first aid kit from his car and began cleaning the wound, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. As he worked, a flicker of recognition sparked. "I know you," Evan said, dabbing gently at the gash. "You spoke at the Veterans Memorial last year. You're Walt Granger." Walt gave a small nod, wincing as Evan applied pressure to the wound. "My grandfather, he fought in Korea," Evan added, his voice thick with emotion. "He used to talk about men like you." There was no pride in Walt's eyes, only the humility of a man who understood that real service left scars, not medals. Across the lot, Brady Knox and his crew grew increasingly restless. They whispered among themselves, glancing nervously at Walt, at Evan, at the small crowd that now watched with a different kind of attention, not idle curiosity, but simmering outrage. They could feel the shift in the air. The tide was turning against them, and then Evan pulled out his phone. But he didn't dial 911. He scrolled quickly to a saved number and pressed call. "Chief Granger? This is Evan Turner," he said. "I'm at Riley's Gas and Service. It's your father. There's been an incident." Brady's face drained of color. The others stiffened. The old man they had mocked, punched, and humiliated. He wasn't just any veteran. He was the father of James Granger, the police chief of Ashford Hollow. Brady cursed under his breath, kicking at the gravel, while his friends muttered anxiously. Evan ended the call and began snapping pictures, license plates, faces, details, moving methodically without fear or hesitation. Walt, watching, touched his arm lightly. "You didn't have to get involved," he said, his voice hoarse. Evan shook his head. "Yes, sir, I did." Moments later, distant sirens pierced the quiet, growing louder with each beat of Walt's heart. The boys panicked, some edging toward their bikes, but Walt simply remained seated against the pump, a pillar of battered dignity. "You can run," Walt thought, looking at them, "but you can't outrun who you are." Two police SUVs screeched into the lot, blue lights flashing, doors flew open, officers poured out with the lethal efficiency of men who had done this many times before. And at their head was James Granger. The family resemblance was striking, the same squared jaw, the same unyielding gaze. But where Walt's face bore the lines of a man who had endured, James's wore the hardened edge of a man who enforced. He marched directly toward the group of young men, radiating fury barely contained. "Which one of you touched him?" he barked. The motorcycle's bravado dissolved. Brady, looking suddenly much smaller in his heavy jacket, raised a trembling hand. "It was me, sir," he stammered. James's nostrils flared. But he didn't yell. His voice was cold and controlled, more terrifying than any shout. "You just assaulted a 70-year-old veteran," he said. "My father." Brady's mouth opened, then closed again, words failing him. James turned slightly, his eyes falling on his father, battered, bleeding, but sitting tall. The old man he had always admired, the man who had taught him everything about honor, respect, and standing for the right thing, still teaching lessons, even from the ground. James drew a long breath, then faced the boys again. "You're all coming with us," There would be no escaping this. Not today. Not from the long shadow cast by the dignity of Walter Granger. The flashing blue lights bathed Riley's gas and service in an eerie glow, casting long, restless shadows across the cracked asphalt. The townspeople had begun to gather along the edges of the lot, pulled in by the sirens, the commotion, the undeniable pull of something important unfolding before their eyes. James Granger stood at the center of it all, his authority wrapping around him like an invisible shield. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply stared at the 5 young men who had dared to put their hands on his father, and the weight of that gaze alone made Brady Knox and his crew squirm where they stood. James's voice was low and cold. "Which of you thought it was acceptable," he said, "to strike a 70-year-old man, a veteran who fought for rights you don't even understand?" Brady swallowed hard, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "It was a misunderstanding, sir," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. James stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Let me make it clear for you," he said, his words slicing through the cold morning air. "A misunderstanding doesn't leave a man bleeding on the concrete." Brady flinched, but James wasn't finished. "My father survived battlefields on the other side of the world so that punks like you could stand here running your mouths and playing tough. And this is how you repay that?" The silence was suffocating. Even the onlookers held their breath, afraid to break the fragile moment. James turned to his officers. "Start identifying everyone. Record plates, personal information. No one leaves without giving a statement." The officers moved quickly, efficient and professional. Brady's friends, so loud, so cocky minutes before, now stood with their shoulders hunched and heads bowed, the consequences of their actions settling heavily on them. But Walt Granger, still seated against the fuel pump, raised a hand, halting the storm with a single weary gesture. James noticed immediately. He crossed the lot to his father, kneeling beside him. "Dad, we've got this," he said softly. "You don't need to worry." Walt shook his head slowly, the movement sending a fresh wave of pain through his battered body. "This isn't just about punishment, son," Walt said, voice low but unwavering. "It's about teaching, about offering a choice." James stared at him, torn between duty and the profound respect he had always carried for the man who had shaped him. "You want me to offer them leniency?" James asked, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "No," Walt answered firmly. "I want to offer them redemption." James looked over his shoulder at the group of young men. They looked nothing like the brash bullies who had laughed moments before. They looked like lost boys now, frightened and ashamed. After a long moment, James stood. He returned to the center of the gathering, all eyes following his every move. "You have 2 options," he said, voice carrying across the lot. "Face formal charges for assaulting an elderly veteran, and trust me, the judge won't be kind." He let the threat settle for a beat. "Or," he continued, "you accept an alternative. A proposal made by the man you wronged." Brady frowned, clearly confused. James gestured to Walt, who was slowly getting to his feet with Evan's help. "You will complete 60 hours of community service at the Ashford Veterans Support Center," James explained. "You'll work under the supervision of the very people you disrespected. You'll listen to their stories. You'll carry their burdens." The young men exchanged glances. 60 hours didn't sound like much, but facing the men and women whose sacrifices they had mocked, that was a different kind of punishment. Brady swallowed, a tight knot forming in his throat. He looked at Walt, really looked at him, and saw not weakness, but an unbreakable kind of strength, the kind built over a lifetime of standing tall against the worst the world had to offer. "I'll do it," Brady said, his voice rough but steady. "I'll serve." One by one, the others echoed him. "I'll serve. I'll serve." James nodded once, a small flicker of approval flashing in his eyes, but he made no move to comfort them. The real work hadn't even begun. He turned back to Walt, who stood quietly by Evan, the very picture of battered dignity. Walt didn't need to speak. His eyes said it all. This wasn't about winning. It was about planting seeds that might one day grow into something better. And in that cold, broken parking lot, under a gray, indifferent sky, the first fragile roots of redemption began to take hold. The cold air lingered over Riley's gas and service as the last of the patrol cars pulled away, leaving the parking lot strangely quiet. The bystanders dispersed slowly, some murmuring about what they had witnessed, others shaking their heads, with the heavy knowledge that few things ever change without sacrifice. Walt Granger stood with the help of Evan Turner, his battered frame upright, his spirit refusing to bow. Across from him, Brady Knox and the other young men gathered, their bravado stripped away, leaving only awkwardness and a gnawing sense of guilt. James Granger watched them from the edge of the lot, arms crossed, every inch of him the authoritative figure Ashford Hollow knew and respected. But today he wasn't just enforcing the law, he was helping rebuild something far more fragile, the conscience of lost youth. Walt took a few careful steps toward the group, his boots scuffing against the cracked pavement. "Come closer," he said, voice rough but strong. The boys hesitated, then shuffled forward under the watchful gaze of the crowd that still lingered at a distance. Walt studied them, the tattoos meant to scare, the leather jackets, the false armor, of arrogance they had worn so proudly only an hour earlier. Now they were just boys, lost, ashamed, redeemable. "I've seen real fights," Walt began, his tone measured. "Real violence, the kind where men don't get up afterward." Brady shifted uncomfortably, guilt flashing across his face. "You," Walt said, pointing lightly at him. "You thought you were making a statement by knocking down an old man." Brady's eyes dropped to the ground. "But you didn't knock me down," Walt continued. "You knocked down your own respect, your own honor." The words landed heavier than any blow could. "I am giving you a choice," Walt said, "not because you deserve it, but because someone once gave me one when I didn't deserve it either." The boys looked up, surprised. "I was young once too," Walt said, a faint smile ghosting across his bruised lips. "Angry, lost. Somebody showed me a different way, not with fists, but with patience." He pulled a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket, the same one stained with blood from earlier, and unfolded it carefully. "This," he said, holding it up, "belonged to my wife. She made me promise that no matter how bad the world looked, I would always believe there was still good in it." The words caught in his throat for a moment, the raw ache of memory pressing hard against his ribs. "I'm keeping that promise today," he finished, his voice rough with emotion. Brady looked at the ground again, blinking hard. Walt stepped back, giving them space to breathe. "You'll report to the Veterans Support Center starting tomorrow," James said, taking over. 60 hours minimum, real work, no excuses. You show up late, you leave early, you disrespect anyone, and you'll answer to me." The boys nodded, the weight of their new reality settling on their shoulders. Evan approached then, standing beside Walt like a quiet pillar of support. "Understand this," Evan said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about cleaning floors or stacking boxes. It's about listening, about learning what it means to carry someone else's pain." The young men looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, there was no defiance in their faces, only a tentative, uncertain willingness to change. As the group dispersed, making plans to meet at the center the next morning, Walt leaned heavily against the pump. Evan was at his side in an instant. "You all right, Mr. Granger?" he asked. Walt gave a small chuckle that turned into a wince. "I've been through worse," he said. "But, thank you, son." Evan smiled, a mixture of humility and pride. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just showing up for the right fight." Walt looked out across the empty lot, the bruises on his body a painful reminder of the morning's events. But deeper inside, beneath the physical pain, there was a spark of something stronger. Hope. It was fragile, yes, but real. Maybe the world wasn't lost yet. Maybe honor wasn't just a relic buried with old soldiers. Maybe, just maybe, by standing tall when it mattered most, one battered man could light a fire that would keep burning long after he was gone, as the last rays of the winter sun faded into a bruised purple sky. Walt allowed himself a rare, private smile. Tomorrow would bring hard work, difficult conversations, growing pains, but it would also bring something even rarer, a second chance, not just for the boys, but for everyone willing to believe that change was still possible. And that, Walt thought, was worth every bruise he carried tonight. The next morning, the sharp bite of winter clung to Ashford Hollow like a second skin. The streets were slick with frost, and the sun, weak and tentative, cast long, crooked shadows across the sidewalks. Inside the Ashford Veterans Support Center, the smell of fresh paint and brewed coffee mingled in the air. The place wasn't fancy, just brick walls, worn floors, and second-hand furniture. But it was alive with something stronger than luxury. Pride. Walter Walt Granger sat by the window, a thick wool blanket draped over his knees. From his chair, he watched as Brady Knox and the other boys stumbled in, blinking against the bright overhead lights. They looked awkward in their heavy jackets and worn-out boots, unsure of where to stand or what to say. Evan Turner was already there, clipboard in hand, ready to supervise. "Morning," Evan said simply, no judgment in his tone. Brady nodded, barely meeting his eyes. "Today," Evan continued, "you're here to listen first. Work will come later. Right now, you need to understand the place you're helping." He gestured toward the common room where a few veterans sat, some in wheelchairs, others with prosthetic limbs, all carrying the invisible weight of battles fought and sacrifices made. The boys hesitated, shifting nervously. Walt, watching, quietly hid a smile. Good, he thought. Let them feel the discomfort. Let them learn that real strength isn't about fists or threats. It's about facing truths you'd rather ignore. "Go on," Evan urged gently. Brady was the first to move. He approached an older man seated near the window, Sergeant Dale Monroe, a veteran of Vietnam, whose haunted eyes told stories he rarely spoke aloud. Brady cleared his throat awkwardly. "Morning, sir," he said. "Mind if I sit?" Dale looked up, studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. One by one, the others followed, scattering among the veterans like uncertain shadows. Conversations started hesitantly, with awkward questions and shy answers. But as minutes turned into hours, something shifted. Walls began to crumble, stories spilled out, tales of muddy jungles, endless deserts, frozen mountains, memories of friends lost, promises broken, hopes carried across decades. Walt listened to the hum of voices weaving together like threads in a frayed tapestry. He saw Kyle, one of the tougher-looking boys, blinking rapidly as an elderly Navy pilot described the night he was shot down over enemy territory. He watched Brady clench his fists under the table as Sergeant Monroe spoke about coming home to a country that no longer wanted him. The lessons weren't taught with lectures. They were etched into the air, breathed into the spaces between words. By lunchtime, the boys weren't just visitors. They were witnesses. Evan called them together after the meal, handing out cleaning supplies and paintbrushes. "You'll start with the East Wing," he instructed. "We're renovating the therapy rooms." There was no grumbling, no complaints. The boys simply nodded and got to work. Walt rose from his chair slowly, cane in hand, and walked among them as they scrubbed walls, patched holes, and carried old furniture to the dumpster. He didn't need to bark orders. His presence was enough, a quiet reminder of why they were here. Later, as Brady wiped sweat from his brow, he caught Walt's eye across the hallway. There was no defiance there anymore, only respect, maybe even gratitude. As the afternoon light began to fade, Brady approached Walt near the entrance. "Sir," he said, shifting awkwardly, "I just wanted to say, I didn't understand. Before, I didn't know." Walt studied him for a long moment. "No one's born knowing," he said finally. "It's what you choose to learn that defines you." Brady swallowed hard, the words sinking deeper than he expected. "Thank you," he said. Walt gave a small nod. "Thank the ones who never made it home," he said, "and make sure you live a life they'd be proud of." Brady nodded, the weight of those words anchoring him to something stronger than himself. As the boys packed up for the day, promising to return early tomorrow, Walt turned back to the common room, where the veterans sat, sipping coffee and sharing memories under the flickering fluorescent lights. Hope wasn't a roaring fire here. It was a slow, steady burn, the kind that could warm even the coldest winters if you tended it carefully. And today, Walt thought, watching Brady help an elderly veteran into his coat, today, the fire had grown a little stronger. The days stretched into weeks, and Ashford Hollow settled into a rhythm. Cold mornings gave way to grey afternoons, but inside the Ashford Veterans Support Centre, something warmer was growing, the slow, careful rebuilding of fractured character. Walter. Walt Granger watched it happen from his chair near the entrance. Every day Brady Knox and his crew returned, shedding layers of pride with every bucket of paint, every floor mopped, every quiet conversation shared over instant coffee. They weren't boys anymore, not completely. They were learning, earning respect in small, invisible ways. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was the path toward it. One afternoon, Walt and Evan Turner were going over supply lists when a noise outside made both men look up. Engines. Not the familiar rumble of pickup trucks or motorcycles from town. These were darker, rougher. Two black SUVs rolled slowly into the parking lot, parking side by side like beasts, settling in for a fight. Walt stiffened immediately. He knew trouble when he saw it. "Evan," he said, voice low and sharp, "get the boys inside." Evan didn't argue. He moved quickly, ushering Brady and the others through the side door, locking it behind them. Walt remained where he was, cane in hand, standing alone on the front steps of the center. He would meet whatever came. As he always had. The SUV's doors opened and men emerged. 6 of them, thick-jacketed and heavy-booted, faces set with the hard edge of menace. At their head walked a man older than the rest, face worn like leather left in the sun too long, eyes cold as the January wind. He wore no insignia, no patches. But he didn't need them. Violence clung to him like smoke. "You're Walt Granger?" the man asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Walt didn't flinch. "I am." The man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Word is, you've been stirring up the kids around here," he said, "teaching them to forget who really runs things." Walt said nothing. Silence was often stronger than words. The man stepped closer. "You think you can fix this town?" he sneered. "With lectures? With handshakes?" Walt's grip tightened around his cane, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't need to fix the town," he said. "Just help a few good souls remember who they are." The man's face darkened. "You're in over your head, old man." Maybe he was. But Walt had been outnumbered before. He knew the power of standing firm when everything around you screamed to run. "I've been over my head my whole life," Walt said, allowing a thin smile to crease his battered face. "Doesn't mean I learned how to drown." The air between them thickened, crackling with tension. Behind the locked doors, Evan and the boys watched from narrow windows, hearts hammering against their ribs. Evan wanted to burst through, to stand beside Walt. But he knew. Sometimes the greatest strength was letting a man fight his own battles. The leader of the group stared at Walt, searching for fear. He found none. After a long moment he spat on the ground, turned on his heel, and barked an order to his men. They climbed back into the SUVs, engines roaring to life, tires screeching as they peeled away into the cold, gray afternoon. The threat was gone. For now. Walt exhaled slowly, the adrenaline buzzing under, his skin like static. Evan rushed outside, the boys following cautiously behind him. "Mr. Granger, are you all right?" Evan asked, gripping his shoulder. Walt nodded, slow and deliberate. I'm fine, he said. Brady looked at him wide-eyed. Why didn't you call the cops? He asked. Walt turned to him, his gaze steady. Because not. Every fight is won with fists or badges, he said. Some are won by showing you're not afraid to stand your ground. The boys absorbed his words like sponges, their young faces marked by something deeper than fear. Respect. Real, hard-earned respect. Later, when they sat together inside over hot coffee, Walt spoke again. You don't change the world by shouting, he said. You change it by showing up, by refusing to be moved when it matters most. Outside, the snow began to fall. Thin, delicate flakes swirling in the wind. Inside, Walt saw something stronger than snowfall. He saw the beginnings of men who might someday choose to stand tall, even when the odds were stacked against them. And that, he thought, was how real change started. One stand, one heart, one choice at a time. The snowfall thickened overnight, blanketing Ashford Hollow in a muted hush. The town, so often worn and weary, looked almost pure beneath the fresh coat of white. Inside the Ashford Veterans Support Center, the warmth of wood stoves and shared laughter pushed back against the winter chill. Walt Granger sat by the window, as he did most mornings now, his battered hands cradling a cup of black coffee. The boys, Brady Knox and his crew, moved about the center with steady purpose. Gone were the awkward hesitations and resentful grimaces. Now they worked with a rhythm built from pride and responsibility. Brady helped Sergeant Dale Monroe rearrange furniture in the common room. Kyle was touching up the mural they had started, a sprawling tribute to the sacrifices of soldiers past. Walt watched them, a quiet satisfaction blooming in his chest. It hadn't been easy. It never was. But the seed planted in broken ground had taken root. He turned slightly as Evan Turner approached, a clipboard tucked under one arm. They're different now, Evan said, settling into the chair beside him. Walt nodded slowly. They're becoming men, he said, the kind the world needs more of. Outside, snow continued to fall in lazy spirals. It would be a harsh winter, but inside the center, there was something tougher than the cold. Hope. Later that day, Brady gathered his courage and approached Walt directly. Mr. Granger, he said, voice steady but soft. I was wondering if I could ask you something. Walt gestured for him to sit. Brady lowered himself into the chair across from him, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. I know what I did was wrong, he began. I don't expect forgiveness, but how do you live with mistakes like that? Walt leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window. You don't erase mistakes, he said after a moment. You don't pretend they didn't happen. You carry them, like scars. He tapped his chest lightly, over his heart. And you let them remind you of the man you refuse to be again. Brady swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling deep in his bones. Does it get easier? He asked. Walt's smile was sad but kind. No, he said, but it gets more meaningful. The center's front door creaked open then, letting in a burst of cold air, and with it, townsfolk carrying donations, blankets, food, handwritten letters of gratitude. The ripple effect had begun. Ashford, hollow, battered and tired though it was, had taken notice. A veteran stood. Boys stood with him, and now others were joining the stand. James Granger entered a few moments later, brushing snow from his shoulders, a rare, genuine smile lighting his face. He crossed the room and clapped Brady lightly on the back. Good to see you here, James, said Brady, flushed with pride, not because it absolved him of his mistakes, but because he knew he had started to earn something far more valuable. Trust. James turned to Walt then, his voice dropping. City Council wants to recognize the center, he said, officially. Dedicate it in your name. Walt shook his head immediately. I didn't do this for plaques, he said. This place belongs to all of them. Not just me. James nodded, understanding. But deep down, he knew. Without Walt, without his stubborn heart and quiet resilience, none of this would have happened. Evening settled in slowly, painting the windows with soft amber light. Walt, Evan, and the boys sat together at the large communal table, steaming bowls of stew before them, stories passing back and forth in low, reverent tones. Not stories of victory, not stories of grandeur, stories of survival, of loyalty, of brotherhood. Outside, Ashford. Hollow slept beneath its quilt of snow. Inside, the center buzzed with the fragile but fierce energy of change. Walt leaned back in his chair, his body tired but his spirit content. He caught Evan's eye across the table and gave a small nod. They had built something here, something real. Not just a place where veterans could heal, but a place where broken boys could learn to stand tall. Where mistakes didn't end lives, they forged new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mistakes, new opportunities to fight for something good. But for now, surrounded by hard-won trust and the quiet hum of hope, Walt Granger allowed himself a rare luxury. He believed in tomorrow, truly believed. The sun rose slowly over Ashford Hollow, spilling muted gold across the rooftops blanketed in snow. It was a quiet morning, one of those rare sacred moments when the world seemed to hold its breath. At Riley's Gas and Service, the small station, where everything had begun, a few trucks were parked, their drivers huddling inside, sipping coffee from cracked mugs. But today, the usual rhythm of the town paused for something more important. Inside the newly restored Ashford Veterans Support Center, final preparations were underway. Banners hung neatly from the walls. Tables were arranged with care, bearing pictures of local veterans, tokens of respect that felt more genuine than any ceremony could express. Walter Walt Granger stood just outside, his heavy coat pulled tight, against the crisp morning air. His cane planted firmly in the snow, he looked over the center, pride swelling quietly in his chest. Not pride in himself, but pride in what had been built, in the people who had risen from the ashes of their own, mistakes to carry something forward. Evan Turner approached, his breath steaming in the cold. "Big day," he said, offering Walt a small, conspiratorial grin. Walt chuckled, the sound low and rough. "I've survived firefights with less preparation," he joked. Evan laughed, then grew serious. "Are you ready?" he asked. Walt considered the question, then nodded. "As ready as anyone can be," he said. Inside, the hall filled quickly. Veterans, townsfolk, families with children bundled in scarves and mittens. Brady Knox and the others stood near the front, wearing clean jackets, faces scrubbed raw by humility and hard lessons learned. At exactly 10 o'clock, James Granger stepped onto the small stage, his uniform pressed to perfection, his voice strong. "We're here today," James began, "to recognize not just a man, but a movement built on honor, on redemption, on the stubborn belief that even the broken parts of us can be reforged into something better." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Ashford Hollow owes a debt to Walter Granger," James continued. "Not because he demanded it, but because he showed us what it means to stand firm when it matters most." The applause that followed was not loud, but it was deep, resonant, a sound of real respect. James gestured for Walt to join him on stage. With a slow, deliberate step, Walt made his way up, cane tapping softly against the wooden floor. He faced the crowd, his hands steady despite the tremors of age. "You don't need to name a building after me," Walt said, his voice carrying strong and clear. "I didn't do this alone." He looked toward Brady and the others. "I didn't build this place. You did. With every choice you made to be better. With every hour you spent learning instead of running." He shifted his gaze across the room, meeting the eyes of the veterans who had carried the weight of wars long past. "And you," he said, voice catching for a moment. "You carried the light when the rest of the world forgot." A hush fell over the room, thick with emotion. Walt took a breath, steadying himself. "Honor isn't in medals," he said. "It's not in speeches. It's in what you do when nobody's watching. It's in standing up again and again when everything inside you says to stay down." He stepped back then, letting the moment belong not to him, but to everyone there. The banner behind him, simple and unadorned, read, "Ashford Veterans Support Center, a place to stand." Later, after the ceremony had ended and the crowd had thinned, Walt sat outside on a weathered bench, sipping hot coffee from a tin cup. Evan joined him quietly. For a while they said nothing, simply watching the town they had helped change breathe beneath the soft winter sky. Finally, Evan spoke. "You think it'll last?" he asked. Walt didn't answer right away. He took another sip of coffee, then smiled. "Nothing good ever comes easy," he said. "But if enough people are willing to stand, even for a little while, it'll last longer than we will." Evan nodded, understanding more in that moment than any lesson a classroom could offer. Brady and the boys came out then, laughing quietly, tossing snowballs, their youthful energy filling the air. Walt watched them, his heart full. Mistakes didn't define a man. The choice to rise after them did. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the snow, Walt Granger closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the peace settle deep in his bones. He had fought many battles in his life, but none had mattered more than this one, the battle to believe, to endure, to inspire. And in Ashford Hollow, beneath the watchful eye of the old gas station and the proud flag fluttering in the breeze, that battle had been won, quietly, stubbornly, and forever.